Welcome to this interview with Professor William Child, author of Wittgenstein, part of the Routledge Philosophers series. How did the cultural atmosphere of Wittgenstein's childhood, surrounded as he was by art and music and such, did it influence the development of his philosophical ideas at all?
Well, that's a very interesting question. He said to a friend in later life something like this: I can't write one word in my book, and he meant philosophical investigations. I can't write one word in my book about all that music has meant in my life. How then can I be understood? So from his own assessment, music and art were important to the kind of person he was, the kind of life he lived. That didn't have an impact explicitly and obviously on his ideas. I mean, he didn't really write in his work about music or about art, though there are a few intriguing comments or kind of analogies. But the well, as I said, it undoubtedly influenced the kind of person he was, and there are interesting kind of analogies about music in both his early work, the Tractatus, and in his later work, the Investigations. So, in the Tractatus, he had advanced a so-called picture theory of representation. Right? A representation is a picture of what it represents, and it's interesting that he applied that idea to music as well. Right? So he said that a musical theme, the representation of a musical theme on the stave, the representation or the representation of a musical theme in the grooves of a gramophone record. There's a picturing relation between the representation and the thing represented. And it's not every philosopher who would have applied an idea about linguistic representation to music.
Which philosopher was the biggest influence on the development of his ideas, and why was that?
Well, I'd say two, really. The German logician Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, the kind of great English logician, philosopher of mathematics and philosopher. The influence of Frege and Russell and their importance is much more obvious in Wittgenstein's first work, the Tractatus, where both are mentioned by name and where he's obviously and explicitly wrestling with problems about logic and linguistic representation that they were wrestling with, and Russell was Wittgenstein's sort of teacher. Wittgenstein went to Cambridge in order to work with Russell, and he went to visit Frege and talk to Frege about his ideas. But I think the influence of Frege and Russell is also present in Wittgenstein's later work, though kind of much less obvious, but because they are representatives of an approach to language and approach to representation that Wittgenstein is obviously reacting against in philosophical investigations. So there are, in the investigations, it may not be that, Russell and Frege are actually mentioned, but their ideas are often kind of on the table or often under consideration, even when they're not being mentioned by name, as also actually is Wittgenstein's own earlier view from the Tractatus. So I'd say that Frege and Russell are the biggest influences initially in formulating the views and the debate to which he was contributing in the Tractatus, and then as representatives of an approach to philosophy and a set of philosophical doctrines that he was reacting against in his later work.
Wittgenstein is seen as one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. What's it about his work that makes him a great philosopher?
Well, so one kind of answer is, he's a great philosopher because he wrote important books, but then obviously the next question is, well, why were these books important books? The Tractatus, I suppose, because it contributed in an important way to the development of kind of analytic philosophy of language and philosophical logic and logic, inaugurated by Frege and Russell. And it was evidently an important contribution in that tradition, and seen as such by the philosophers of the Vienna Circle, and then in Cambridge and United States. So, it was the Tractatus was working in a tradition. I suppose it was obviously the product of a great mind, and I'm sure attracted people because of the way in which it's written, in the sort of very, very sparse numbered paragraphs. So the Tractatus is a contribution to an existing tradition. Philosophical Investigations was felt by many people in the middle of the middle of the 20th century to be, to represent a wholly new way of doing philosophy, and it clearly was, in Wittgenstein's own view, a reaction against many of the ideas of the Tractatus. And again was regarded as kind of tremendously exciting and taken up by people as representing, a new way of conceiving of philosophy and of conceiving of philosophical problems. So philosophical problems were thought of as being not kind of genuine problems, but requiring kind of diagnosis or arising from confusions of thought. I think kind of nowadays, there are many different approaches to Wittgenstein. So many people are still impressed by Wittgenstein's conception of a philosophical problem and are kind of taken with that meta-philosophy. But others who aren't so convinced by Wittgenstein's conception of what a philosophical problem is are still deeply impressed by Wittgenstein's acute sense of the phenomena that he's writing about. So he wrote an enormous amount about kind of mental phenomena, about sensation, experience, emotion, belief, and so forth. And his comments and observations about those phenomena are kind of extremely acute and insightful. And for philosophy, even for philosophers who wouldn't count themselves Wittgensteinians, they're, many of them are absolutely fundamental insights to, say, the nature of belief and our knowledge of our own beliefs, or kind of the nature of emotion or our relation to our own bodies. So there are these kind of two great works, and an enormous amount of very deep thought going into them.
Wittgenstein is known to have dismissed the attempts for the scholars to explain or discuss his work.
Yeah.
And since he's not around to interject now on what we're suggesting about it, so, how can we be sure we're understanding him correctly?
Well, I suppose the short answer is we can't. But I would say something about his dismissiveness of the attempts of some of his students and interlocutors to represent his views. I think that dismissiveness is to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, because the important thing to recognise is that he's very dismissive of his own attempts to state his own views. Really? So he was constantly revising his formulations of points, constantly rewriting his work. He made several attempts to get his later philosophy into the form of a book that he could publish. He offered a book at various points to the University Press in Cambridge. He was never contented with what he'd done. So Wittgenstein's dismissiveness of other people's attempts to state his views, I'm sure partly stems from his unhappiness with his own statements of his views. So a student might have been representing absolutely accurately the views that he'd expressed in a lecture or a series of lectures, but Wittgenstein could still be dissatisfied with that, or not want that published to the wider world because he didn't like the formulation himself. Wow. So I'd say that that's a really important feature of his work. He's kind of constantly rethinking his work. And I guess all academics are somewhat obsessive and perfectionist, but Wittgenstein took that to new heights, I think.
In the Tractatus, he said he believed he'd solved all the problems of philosophy. Yes. In time, though, he came to reassess those beliefs and began to explore new ideas. What changed for him? What brought him back to that, to the idea that there was more to explore?
Well, the Tractatus was a very sort of abstract and in some ways hands-off view. He thought he knew at a general level how language had to function in order to represent reality, and he thought that so he thought that there must be a basic level at which basic elements of language attach to basic elements of reality by kind of a direct relation of naming. Right? And he thought he knew the general shape by which propositions of our ordinary language would be analysed down into the elementary propositions which are the point at which language makes direct contact with reality. However, he didn't think it was his business actually to conduct this analysis. So, he told us, how in general terms language would have to function in order to represent reality, but he didn't think it was his business, and it seems he wasn't particularly interested in working out how it would actually work in detail for actual bits of ordinary language. Well, it seems that what brought him back to philosophy and made him change his views was grappling with the problem of how, in fact, actual bits of language function. And it looks as though what kind of made him face that task was trying to explain elements of the Tractatus to some of the students and young scholars who were interested in the Tractatus and came to talk to him about it. So the kind of Cambridge mathematician and economist philosopher Frank Ramsey went to visit him in Austria when he was a primary school teacher there, and they had long conversations about the Tractatus, and it seems that Ramsey pressed him on the question of how language represents experience. Right? So if I say, I have a pain or you have a pain, how does I have a pain how does that have a meaning, and how does you have a pain have meaning? What's the relationship between the meaning of the word pain on my lips as applied to me and as applied to you? And that's a problem that Wittgenstein kind of grappled with, amongst others, on his return to philosophy in 1929. Other sort of philosophers and academics that he encountered in Cambridge, also notably an Italian economist, Piero Sraffa, is sort of credited with making comments to Wittgenstein that made him give up the idea that language had to be isomorphic with reality. Sraffa is supposed to have said, well, what's the logical form of this gesture, right? It's a sort of meaningful gesture, but it doesn't have a logical form. It doesn't share a logical form with reality. So I think it was, as it were, rolling up his sleeves and getting involved in the nitty-gritty of thinking how actual bits of language actually function that moved Wittgenstein away from the kind of abstract uniform theory of representation of the Tractatus and towards a much more eclectic, less essentialist, more practical approach to language and meaning in his later philosophy.